I ignored every warning and put my entire marriage on the line to protect the company my father built from nothing. I gave my husband everything only to have a terrified accountant whisper that 19 of my own employees were answering directly to my mother-in-law. By the time the sun came up the next morning, my husband had chosen a side, and it was not mine. My name is Claire Sterling. I am 31 years old, a financial controller who unexpectedly had to step up and run my late father's mid-sized logistics company here in Seattle. While most women in their 20s were out traveling the world, going to brunches or building their own dreams, I spent mine trapped in a windowless office working 80-hour weeks to keep the family business afloat. I poured every extra dollar I earned, every bonus, every ounce of my energy into paying off my husband Julian's massive student loans. He had racked up over $90,000 in debt, getting his finance degree. I wore thrift store clothes, packed peanut butter sandwiches for lunch, and skipped vacations for 6 years just to see that debt balance hit zero. I did it because I loved him. I did it because I believed a marriage was a partnership. I thought we were building a life together. I thought family protected family. I was so incredibly wrong. The nightmare began on a rainy Tuesday morning, exactly 1 day after we lowered my father into the ground. My dad had been the heart and soul of Sterling Logistics. He started the company with a single-use delivery truck and worked his fingers to the bone until it became a multi-million-dollar supply chain network. His sudden death from a massive heart attack left me shattered. I was wearing the same black dress from the funeral because I was too numb, too exhausted to pick out anything else. My eyes were swollen, my chest felt hollow, and all I wanted was to crawl into bed and sleep for a month. But my father's company needed a leader. I could not let his legacy falter, not even for a single day. I walked into his office, which now felt suffocatingly empty. The faint smell of his peppermint tea still lingered in the air, a cruel reminder that he was never coming back. I barely had time to sit down at his heavy oak desk when the phone rang. It was David Bradley, the head of our largest regional supplier. Usually David was a friendly voice. He was someone who asked about my dad's health, someone who had attended our summer barbecues, someone who sent fruit baskets at Christmas. That morning his voice was ice cold. He told me he was calling in our short-term debt. All of it. Immediately. I felt the blood drain from my face. I asked him what he meant, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. We had a net 60 agreement. We always paid on time. My father had done business with his company for 2 solid decades. David just cleared his throat. He sounded robotic, like he was reading from a script. He said company policy had changed. He cited a restructuring in our management due to my father's passing, claiming that without my dad at the helm, Sterling Logistics was now considered a high-risk account. He demanded $1.2 million by the end of the week. If the funds were not wired, he would halt all operations and seize our current cargo in transit. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the receiver. I begged him to reconsider, reminding him of 20 years of loyalty, but he hung up on me. I immediately dialed our commercial bank to tap into our emergency line of credit. My father had set it up specifically for unforeseen crises, a safety net that was supposed to protect us from exactly this kind of ambush. The bank manager, a man who had shaken my hand at the memorial service just yesterday and offered his deepest condolences, sounded incredibly uncomfortable. He stammered, cleared his throat, and then delivered the second devastating blow of the morning. He told me the credit line was frozen. I asked him to repeat himself. I told him there must be a clerical error. He explained that due to a sudden anonymous flag on our risk assessment profile, the bank had suspended all drawing privileges pending a full financial review, a review that would take at least 30 days. I was staring down the barrel of imminent bankruptcy. Without that supplier, our trucks would not move. Without the credit line, we could not pay the supplier. In less than 24 hours, after saying goodbye to the man who gave me everything, I was about to lose his entire legacy. Panic clawed at my throat like a wild animal. I pulled out ledgers, spreadsheets, and contact lists. I spent the next 8 hours calling every secondary lender, every private equity contact, every business associate I knew in the greater Seattle area. Every single one gave me the same rehearsed rejection. The doors were slamming shut one by one, locking me in a burning room. I thought about the warehouse workers who depended on us. Men like old Bill, who had watched me grow up and had a wife battling cancer. Women who had mortgages to pay and children to feed. I thought about my father coming home with grease on his hands and a proud smile on his face, telling me that taking care of your people is the only thing that truly matters in business. The weight of it all pressed down on my shoulders until I could barely breathe. By the time I left the office, the Seattle rain had turned into a torrential downpour, matching the absolute despair settling deep in my chest. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I just needed my husband. I needed Julian to hold me, to tell me we would figure this out together, just like I had figured out how to pay off his massive debts when he had nothing. When I walked through the front door of our home, Julian was sitting at the kitchen island, perfectly groomed as always. Not a hair out of place, wearing a crisp, expensive button-down shirt, looking like he had stepped right out of a luxury catalog. He poured me a glass of wine. For a brief second, I felt a wave of profound gratitude. I took a sip and let the tears finally spill over. I told him everything. The treacherous supplier, the frozen credit line, the relentless bank manager, the impending bankruptcy. I sobbed, telling him I was going to lose my dad's company and let down every single person who worked for us. Julian did not hug me. He did not offer a word of comfort. He just took a slow, measured sip of his own wine and set the glass down on the marble counter. He looked at me with an expression that was entirely too calm. He said there was an easy solution. He said his mother was willing to step in and save us. I froze. My tears stopped, instantly replaced by a deep, instinctual knot of pure dread. His mother was Beatrice Brooks. Beatrice was a ruthless corporate raider based in Chicago. She was a woman who made her fortune buying struggling family businesses, gutting them from the inside out, firing the loyal staff, and selling the scraps to the highest bidder. But beyond her notorious business reputation, Beatrice despised me on a deeply personal level. From the very first day Julian brought me home to meet her, she had looked down her surgically enhanced nose at my working-class roots. She had sneered at my modest clothes, openly mocked my father's blue-collar background, and made it very clear that the daughter of a glorified truck driver was not good enough for her polished upper-crust son. Every family holiday was a miserable minefield of her passive-aggressive insults. I stared at Julian, hoping it was a sick joke. I told him absolutely not. I would never let Beatrice get her claws into my father's company. Julian sighed, letting out the long, patronizing breath he always used when he wanted to make me feel small and irrational. He leaned forward, clasping his perfectly manicured hands together. He told me I was letting my stubborn pride cloud my judgment. He explained that his mother's investment fund could buy a 30% equity stake in Sterling Logistics. It would inject enough cash to pay off the supplier, unfreeze the payroll, and keep the trucks moving. He called it a generous family lifeline. I called it a hostile takeover. I stood up from the kitchen stool, my voice shaking with a sudden fierce anger. I reminded him of how she had treated me for years. I reminded him that my father had completely despised Beatrice's cutthroat business practices, that my dad had built his company on honesty and hard work, not on ruining people's livelihoods. I told Julian that bringing her into our business was like inviting a starving wolf into a sheep pen. His calm, composed demeanor vanished in an instant. His face flushed bright red, and his voice rose to a harsh shout. He slammed his hand hard on the counter, telling me I was being an ungrateful, stubborn fool. He threw my father's death right in my face, saying my dad was gone and his outdated, sentimental business model was failing. He yelled that he had a certain lifestyle to maintain, a reputation in the financial district to uphold, and that he was not going to sink into bankruptcy and ruin his own life just because I was too proud to accept a business deal from my own mother-in-law. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. He was talking about his lifestyle, his reputation. He did not care about my immense grief. He did not care about my father's legacy. He certainly did not care about the 70 employees who were about to lose their jobs and their health insurance. I stared at the man I had married, The man I had sacrificed my entire youth to support financially, and for the very first time I saw a complete stranger looking back at me. A cold, calculating stranger. I told him I would rather sell my own house and sleep in my car than sell 30% of the company to Beatrice. I told him I would figure out another way without his help, without her money. I turned my back on him and walked into the living room, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I thought the terrible argument was over. I thought I had made my boundary abundantly clear. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an urgent automated email notification from our primary payroll processing bank. The subject line was flagged in bright red, demanding immediate attention. I opened it, my eyes desperately scanning the harsh, unforgiving corporate language. Due to the ongoing hold on our operational accounts and the severe unexplained risk assessment flags, the bank was officially initiating a total freeze. If a certified cash deposit of $1.2 million was not secured and cleared by Friday morning, they would officially block all payroll distributions for the entire company. It was Wednesday night. My employees were hardworking people living paycheck to paycheck. If they did not get paid on Friday, they could not pay their rent. They could not buy groceries for their children. They would default on their car loans. The company would not just fail financially, it would fail morally. It would collapse in absolute public disgrace. Julian walked slowly into the living room, watching my face crumble in real time as I read the devastating email. He did not ask what was wrong. He already seemed to know exactly what the message said. He crossed his arms and looked down at me with cold, triumphant eyes. He did not offer to hold my hand. He did not offer a word of support. Instead, he delivered an ultimatum that would alter the course of my entire life. He told me I had until tomorrow morning to make my choice. Save the company by accepting his mother's money and signing over the equity, or watch everything my father spent a lifetime building burn straight to the ground by Friday. The sun did not even bother to shine that Thursday morning. I was back at my desk by 5, gripping a cold cup of coffee and dialing every regional bank manager in the Pacific Northwest. I had 24 hours before the payroll freeze took effect. My father had pristine credit. Sterling Logistics was a cornerstone of the Seattle supply chain. We should have been an easy approval for a bridge loan to cover the sudden debt. But every single call went exactly the same way. The loan officers would start out warm, eager to help the grieving daughter of an industry legend. They would put me on hold to run a preliminary check. Then they would come back on the line with their voices tight and formal. They cited sudden shifts in market risk. They mentioned vague compliance holds. One executive at a mid-sized commercial bank finally took pity on me. He lowered his voice, telling me off the record that my company had been flagged in a shared financial database. A massive corporate entity had placed a shadow risk warning on our profile. He did not say the name Beatrice Brooks, but he did not have to. My mother-in-law had used her massive financial leverage to build an invisible brick wall around me. She was starving me out. The realization hit me with physical force. This was not just a string of bad luck. It was a highly coordinated siege. Beatrice was deliberately choking off my air supply so I would have no choice but to crawl to her for oxygen. I drove home that night feeling completely defeated. The heavy Seattle rain lashed against my windshield, a perfect reflection of the chaos inside my head. I walked through the front door of our house, desperately expecting Julian to ask how my day went, to offer some semblance of partnership. Instead, I found him standing in our hallway with a leather duffel bag packed and sitting by the door. My heart dropped straight into my stomach. I asked him what he was doing, my voice trembling. He turned to me, his jaw set hard, his eyes completely devoid of the warmth I had fallen in love with all those years ago. He told me he was going to a hotel. He said he could not stay in a house with a woman who was actively choosing to destroy their future out of sheer selfish pride. I stood there utterly paralyzed. I reminded him that we were talking about my father's life work, a company that put food on the table for dozens of loyal families. I told him his mother had deliberately sabotaged my credit applications to force a buyout. Julian scoffed loudly. He called me paranoid. He twisted the narrative, effortlessly framing his mother as a generous savior and me as a delusional, ungrateful daughter who was letting grief turn her into a bitter victim. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper. He laid his ultimatum on the table. If I did not call Beatrice and accept the 30% buyout by 8 the next morning, he would file for legal separation. He said he absolutely refused to be chained to a sinking ship. He told me I was letting 70 hard-working people lose their livelihoods because I was too arrogant to accept a helping hand from my own family. The cruelty of his manipulation was staggering. He was using the employees I loved as a weapon against me. He picked up his bag, opened the front door, and walked out into the rain without looking back. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving me standing alone in the suffocating silence of our home. I spent the entire night pacing the living room floors. I thought about the warehouse manager whose wife was undergoing chemotherapy. I thought about the delivery drivers who relied on their Friday paychecks to keep their children fed and their mortgages paid. I thought about the vows I had made to Julian, the entire decade of my youth I had sacrificed to pay off his staggering student debts, the life I genuinely thought we were building together. I was terrified of losing my marriage, terrified of failing my father's people, and terrified of the impending bankruptcy. Fear is a powerful, blinding thing. It makes you ignore the glaring red flags waving right in front of your face. By 6 a.m, my spirit was completely broken. I picked up my phone, my fingers trembling uncontrollably, and dialed Beatrice's private number. She answered on the very first ring, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She told me she was so glad I had finally come to my senses. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting in the sterile glass-walled conference room of Beatrice's downtown investment firm. Julian was already there, sitting right next to his mother. He did not look like a man whose marriage had almost ended the night before. He looked relaxed, triumphant, sipping sparkling water from a crystal glass. The contract was waiting for me. 30% equity in Sterling Logistics, transferred to the Brooks Investment Fund in exchange for an immediate capital injection of $2 million. The documents were thick, filled with dense legal jargon that I barely had the energy to read. My hands shook violently as I picked up the heavy silver pen. I looked across the table at Julian, silently pleading for a sign of reassurance, a comforting glance to tell me we were doing the right thing for our future. He did not smile. He just tapped his perfectly manicured finger against the signature line. I swallowed the thick knot of dread rising in my throat and signed my name. I signed away a third of my father's legacy to the very woman he had always despised. The exact second the ink dried on the final page, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. It was immediate and terrifying. Beatrice smiled a cold, thin smile, gathered the documents, and walked out of the room without saying a single word to me. I turned to Julian, expecting him to pull me into his arms to tell me he was coming home to thank me for saving us. But the charming, loving husband I thought I knew was gone. He stood up, adjusted his expensive tie, and looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated authority. The soft affection he had always used with me was completely replaced by cold corporate detachment. He informed me that since his mother's fund now held a massive stake in my company, there would be immediate operational changes to protect their investment. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder, tossing it casually onto the glass table. He said Sterling Logistics was archaic and needed aggressive modernization. He told me he was bringing in a team of specialized consultants to oversee our internal audits, human resources, and vendor relations. I opened the folder, my chest tightening painfully as I read through the printed list of 19 names. I did not recognize a single one of them. I told Julian I was the chief operating officer and I did not approve of hiring outside personnel without a proper, rigorous vetting process. He leaned over the table, his face inches from mine, his eyes hard and unyielding. He reminded me that I no longer had sole authority over the business. He stated that the new hires would be arriving at the warehouse on Monday morning, and I was to give them full unrestricted access to our private servers, our client databases, and our financial ledgers. He leaned in closer and whispered that if I tried to interfere, His mother would legally block the emergency funds from clearing the bank, and the payroll would bounce anyway. He walked out of the conference room, leaving me sitting completely alone staring at a list of strangers who were about to invade my father's sanctuary. I drove back to the Sterling Logistics warehouse in an absolute daze. The emergency funds had officially cleared the bank. The payroll went through. The immediate financial crisis was supposedly averted. My employees were safe, receiving their direct deposits right on schedule. But walking through the bustling loading docks, listening to the roar of the forklifts and the shouting of the dispatchers, I felt an overwhelming sense of doom. I had invited the enemy straight through the front gates. I locked myself in my father's old office, trying desperately to convince myself I had done the right thing. I told myself I had saved the marriage. I told myself Julian would calm down once the extreme stress of the debt was handled. I was desperately trying to cling to the illusion of my perfect life. Then at exactly 4 p.m, the phone on my desk rang. It was the direct line, the specific number reserved only for our top-tier clients. I picked it up expecting to hear from the shipping director of Pacific Freight, our oldest and most vital client. My father had secured their business 22 years ago. They accounted for nearly 40% of our entire annual revenue. The voice on the other end belonged to their chief procurement officer. He did not bother with pleasantries. He sounded brisk, slightly apologetic, but incredibly firm. He informed me that Pacific Freight was terminating their exclusive contract with Sterling Logistics, effective immediately. I felt the room spin violently. I gripped the edge of my father's heavy wooden desk, begging the man to explain. We had never missed a delivery. Our error rate was virtually zero. We had bent over backward to accommodate their crazy seasonal demands for 2 decades. The procurement officer sighed heavily into the receiver. He said it was strictly a business decision. He told me they had just received an incredibly aggressive, heavily subsidized proposal from a massive regional competitor. A proposal that undercut our prices by a margin we could never possibly match without going instantly bankrupt. He said the competitor had somehow known the exact highly confidential details of our internal pricing structure and offered a deal they simply could not refuse to their shareholders. I asked him the name of the competitor, my voice barely above a whisper. When he said the name, my blood ran completely cold. It was a subsidiary logistics firm entirely owned by the Brooks Investment Fund, Beatrice's company. My mother-in-law had not just bought 30% of my father's legacy. She had used my signature to steal our biggest client on the exact same day. I sat in the deafening silence of my office, realizing the terrifying truth. The financial crisis, the frozen credit lines, the marital ultimatum. It was all a perfectly orchestrated trap, and my own husband had been the one to lead me right into it. 6 entire months evaporated into a suffocating blur of anxiety and financial panic. When I had signed that contract trading 30% of my father's legacy for a cash injection from the Brooks Investment Fund, I foolishly believed the bleeding would stop. I genuinely thought we could stabilize the supply chain, pay our vendors, and get back to the honest work of running a logistics empire. Instead, Beatrice Brooks' money acted like a highly invasive virus. I spent my days watching my father's life work bleed out in real time. We were losing contracts we had held for over a decade. It was a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 paper cuts. Every single time our sales team submitted a competitive bid for a new routing contract, a rival company undercut us by exactly a few cents. It was mathematically impossible unless someone was handing our proprietary algorithms and internal pricing structures directly to our rivals. Our profit margins plummeted. Our fuel accounts were constantly overdrawn. I would sit in my office late at night staring at spreadsheets that made absolutely no sense, trying to figure out how a company with a massive new cash reserve was suddenly struggling to pay for basic warehouse maintenance. Julian completely brushed off my concerns. He sat in his newly renovated executive suite, a space he had demanded we upgrade using company funds, sipping expensive espresso, and telling me that the logistics market was just experiencing a natural downturn. He said I was being overly emotional. He told me I was letting my grief over my father cloud my business judgment. He played the role of the stressed, hard-working executive perfectly while I was rapidly becoming a stranger in my own company. But the numbers did not lie. I needed to see the raw data. I decided to pull the quarterly expenditure reports to see exactly where our operating costs were ballooning so drastically. I walked to my terminal, typed in my administrative credentials, and stared at a stark red "Access Denied" message flashing across the screen. I thought it was a simple glitch. I marched down the hall to the IT department, a newly formed division populated entirely by the expensive consultants Julian had forced onto my payroll right after the buyout. The head of IT, a smug 30-something named Greg, who always wore expensive sneakers and a condescending smirk, barely looked up from his dual monitors when I walked in. I told him my administrative profile was locked and asked him to reset my permissions immediately. He flatly informed me that my administrative privileges had been permanently downgraded due to a new corporate security protocol. When I demanded he restore my access as the chief operating officer of the company, he leaned back in his ergonomic chair and gave me a chilling, patronizing smile. He told me that Julian had personally authorized the security overhaul. He stated that any requests for master access to the financial servers had to be submitted in writing and approved by the newly formed advisory board, a board entirely controlled by his mother. My husband had effectively locked me out of my own company's financial heartbeat. The betrayal was absolutely suffocating. I went home every night to a house that felt like a freezing museum. Julian and I slept in separate rooms. We spoke only in clipped, polite sentences about schedule logistics. I knew something deeply criminal was happening, but I had absolutely no way to prove it. Every avenue I tried to explore was blocked. My emails were being monitored. My calendar was scrutinized. I could feel the hostile gaze of the new hires tracking my every move whenever I walked across the warehouse floor. The family culture my father had carefully cultivated for 20 years was completely dead. The veteran employees kept their heads down, terrified of the aggressive restructuring. Then, on a dreary Thursday afternoon in late November, the breakthrough finally came. I was walking out to my car in the damp parking lot, pulling my coat tight against the bitter Seattle wind, when I noticed a small folded piece of paper wedged under my windshield wiper. I grabbed it quickly, glancing over my shoulder to make sure none of Julian's corporate lackeys were watching from the office windows. I slipped into the driver's seat, locked the heavy doors, and unfolded the damp paper. The handwriting belonged to Thomas. He was our senior accountant, a quiet, brilliant man who had worked right alongside my father for 2 solid decades. He was the only original executive Julian had not managed to fire yet, mostly because Thomas held the institutional knowledge required to keep the tax agencies from auditing our complex freight accounts. The note was incredibly brief. It named a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Tacoma, a good 40-minute drive south of our headquarters. It specified 8 o'clock that evening. It ended with a single underlined warning not to tell anyone where I was going. I drove through the relentless Pacific Northwest rain, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I parked 3 blocks away from the diner, terrified that Julian had hired someone to follow me. I walked through the pouring rain, my boots splashing through deep puddles, and pushed open the heavy glass door of the restaurant. The place was practically empty. The smell of stale coffee and fried potatoes hung heavy in the warm air. I spotted Thomas sitting in a dim corner booth facing the entrance. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the span of 6 months. His face was pale, his shoulders hunched, and his eyes darted nervously toward the door as I slid into the cracked vinyl seat across from him. He did not bother with pleasantries. He kept his hands below the table, his knuckles completely white. He asked me if I had my phone on me. I nodded. He told me to turn it completely off. I powered the device down and shoved it deep into my purse. Only then did Thomas reach into his worn leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick, heavily bound ledger and slid it slowly across the sticky table. I stared at the black cover. I asked him what it was. His voice trembled, barely rising above the sound of the rain lashing against the diner window. He told me he had been staying late manually pulling physical records from the local branch banks before the new IT department could digitize and alter the archives. He said he had been matching the real payroll outflows against the fabricated reports Julian had been filing with the state. He looked me dead in the eye, his expression completely devastated by what he had uncovered. "Claire, 19 of the new hires don't work for you," he whispered, his voice cracking with fear and sorrow. "They answered directly to your mother-in-law. They are bleeding you dry." I felt all the air leave my lungs. 19 people. Every single consultant, efficiency expert, and management analyst Julian had brought in after we signed the equity deal. I stared at Thomas, begging him to explain how this was possible. He opened the heavy ledger and pointed to the highlighted lines of financial data. He explained that these 19 individuals were not just collecting bloated six-figure salaries from our payroll. They were actively funneling our proprietary client data, our specialized shipping routes, and our private vendor contracts directly to Beatrice Brooks's shell companies. They were systematically dismantling Sterling Logistics from the inside. They were intentionally ensuring the company would fail, so Beatrice could purchase the remaining 70% of our assets for pennies on the dollar during a forced bankruptcy liquidation. The reality of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. The missed bids, the lost clients, the frozen credit lines, none of it was an accident. Julian was not just standing by while his mother ruined my father's company. Julian was the one holding the door wide open for her spies. He had weaponized our marriage to grant them legal access to our servers. He had used my love and my desperation to plant 19 saboteurs right in the middle of my supply chain. Thomas closed the ledger and pushed it toward my chest. He said the book contained every fraudulent wire transfer, every ghost account, and every piece of physical evidence I needed to prove my husband and his mother were orchestrating a massive corporate sabotage. He warned me that if Julian found out we had these physical copies, they would destroy the documents and frame us for the financial losses. I clutched the heavy book to my chest, the rough texture of the cover grounding me in reality. I thanked Thomas, tears burning hot in my eyes. I promised him I would fix this. I promised him that my father's company would survive and that the people who did this would pay for their crimes. I barely slept that night. I drove back to my dark, silent house and crept inside like a thief. I hid the ledger in the floorboard of my spare closet, burying it beneath a stack of old winter coats. I spent the entire night pacing the floorboards, formulating a plan to confront the advisory board, to take this irrefutable evidence straight to our remaining investors, and to rip the charming, deceptive mask right off Julian's face. I was filled with a burning, righteous determination. I was no longer the grieving, desperate daughter trying to save a failing business. I was a woman who had just realized she was at war. I drove to the office the next morning ready to burn their entire scheme to the ground. But when I walked through the sliding glass doors of the main corporate lobby, the fierce adrenaline surging through my veins vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, sickening shock. 2 large armed security guards were standing rigidly by the main elevators. Wedged between them was Thomas. He was clutching a small cardboard box filled with the meager contents of his desk. A framed photo of his wife, a favorite coffee mug, a few pens. His face was completely ashen, his eyes fixed firmly on the polished tile floor. Standing a few feet away, holding a digital tablet and looking entirely unbothered, was Julian. I rushed forward, my voice echoing loudly across the cavernous lobby, as I demanded to know what was happening. I ordered the security guards to step away from my senior accountant immediately. Julian turned to me with a perfectly polite, terrifyingly vacant smile. He did not blink. He did not show an ounce of remorse. He announced loudly, ensuring that the entire lobby of arriving employees could hear every single word, that Thomas was being escorted off the premises for the protection of the company. He casually stated that Thomas had been caught attempting to steal sensitive, confidential financial records late last night. Julian looked right through me, his eyes dead and unfeeling, as if I were nothing but a minor inconvenience in his perfectly orchestrated day. He declared that Thomas was officially fired for gross insubordination and corporate theft. I stood there utterly paralyzed, the breath knocked completely out of me. I watched the only loyal ally I had left in the world being marched out the glass doors in absolute public disgrace. The doors slid shut behind him, leaving me trapped in the lobby with the man I had married. I looked at Julian, realizing with horrifying clarity that my husband had always been 10 steps ahead, and my war had been lost before I even had the chance to fight. Watching the heavy glass doors of the lobby slide shut behind Thomas felt like watching the last lifeboat leave a sinking ship. I stood completely frozen on the polished marble floor of Sterling Logistics. My chest physically ached. My breathing was shallow and uneven. Julian had just fired the only man who knew the truth, framing him for corporate theft in front of a dozen arriving employees. I wanted to scream. I wanted to march up to the executive suite, kick the doors open, and demand answers. But the cold, hard weight of the black ledger hidden in the floorboards of my spare closet anchored me to reality. Screaming would get me nothing but a matching security escort out of the building. My father had not raised a hysterical woman. He had raised a fighter. I forced my hands to uncurl from tight fists, smoothed down my blazer, and walked out to my car with my head held high. I left the office an hour early that day, claiming a migraine. I drove straight home, locked the front door, and pulled the blinds shut. The house was entirely silent. Julian had texted to say he was attending a late networking dinner with his mother and would not be home until midnight. It was the perfect window of opportunity. I went straight to the spare bedroom, pulled away the winter coats, and retrieved the heavy black ledger Thomas had risked his entire career to build. I carried it to my dining room table, brewed a massive pot of dark roast coffee, and opened my laptop. I was no longer a grieving daughter or a desperate wife. I was a financial controller hunting for a leak in her own pipes. I opened the ledger to the first page. Thomas had meticulously listed the names of the 19 new consultants Julian had forced onto my payroll. Beside each name, Thomas had attached routing numbers, payroll dates, and departmental access codes. I started with the head of the new IT department, Greg. I ran his name through a standard background check, pulling up public records, state tax databases, and corporate registries. On paper, Greg looked perfectly legitimate. His resume claimed he had spent the last 5 years consulting for independent supply chain firms across the Midwest. But I knew how to dig deeper. I cross-referenced the business addresses listed on his previous employment history. It took me 3 hours of tracing digital breadcrumbs through the Delaware Department of State Registry, but I finally hit the bedrock. Every single independent firm Greg had supposedly worked for was a registered LLC sharing the exact same corporate agent. And that registered agent belonged to a holding company completely owned by the Brooks Investment Fund, Beatrice Brooks. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I moved down the list. I typed in the name of the new director of risk management, a woman named Amanda, who had recently taken over all of our vendor compliance policies. I tracked her previous tax filings. She had been on Beatrice's direct payroll less than 8 months ago. I moved to the new inventory control manager. I checked the senior bidding analyst. I checked the client relations liaison. One by one, the dominoes fell. Every single one of the 19 highly paid consultants drawing salaries from my father's company was a ghost employee acting as a corporate spy for my mother-in-law. But tracing their employment history was not enough. I needed to understand exactly how they were bleeding us dry. I needed to see the weapon they were using to kill Sterling Logistics. I poured my third cup of coffee, ignoring the bitter taste, and logged into our secondary dispatch software. This was an older, clunky system my father had used before we modernized one. The new IT department apparently did not realize I still monitored. I matched the access logs from the ledger to our daily operational reports. The scale of the sabotage I uncovered was absolutely breathtaking. It was a masterclass in corporate espionage. Amanda in risk management was intentionally flagging our most reliable, cost-effective transport vendors for bogus compliance violations. She was terminating contracts with the independent truckers who had hauled our freight for a decade and replacing them with highly expensive, unreliable shell carriers. That explained the sudden massive spikes in our transportation overhead. The inventory control manager was quietly falsifying our warehouse capacity reports. He was marking our storage bays as completely full when they were actually empty. Because of his reports, our sales team was being forced to turn away highly lucrative overflow contracts from major retailers. We were rejecting millions of dollars in revenue simply because the system falsely claimed we had no room to store the cargo. But the most devastating discovery was in the bidding department. I pulled up the metadata for our client databases. The new senior bidding analyst had installed a mirrored forwarding protocol on our proprietary pricing algorithm. Every single time our sales team generated a customized quote to win a new shipping route, a blind copy of that exact proposal was instantly emailed to an external server. I traced the IP address of that server straight to a subsidiary logistics firm in Chicago. The exact same subsidiary owned by Beatrice Brooks. The truth settled over me like a suffocating blanket of heavy snow. Beatrice was not just reading our emails. She was watching us build our bids in real time. She was using our exact margins, our specific fuel surcharge calculations, and our private vendor discounts to undercut us by mere pennies on the dollar. She was handing our most loyal clients over to her own companies using my own payroll to fund her espionage. She was systematically suffocating my father's legacy so she could force us into a fire sale bankruptcy and buy the remaining 70% of the company for absolute pennies. I sat back in my chair staring at the glowing computer screen until my eyes burned. The digital clock in the corner of the monitor read 3 a.m. Outside, the Seattle rain battered against the dining room windows. My mind spun wildly, desperately trying to protect the man I loved from the horrifying reality staring me in the face. I told myself Julian had been fooled. I told myself his mother had manipulated him, using his desire to help me as a Trojan horse to install her people. I remembered the night he yelled at me in the kitchen demanding I take her money. He had been so stressed, so desperate to maintain his lifestyle. Surely he did not know the extent of her treachery. Surely he had just handed her the hiring authority without checking the backgrounds of the consultants. He was my husband. We had shared a bed for 7 years. I had given up my youth, my vacations, and my peace of mind to pull him out of crushing debt. He could not possibly be a willing participant in the total destruction of my family. I gathered the printed registries, the access logs, and the shell company connections. I highlighted the names, drew connecting lines with a red marker, and arranged the irrefutable proof into a neat, undeniable stack on the kitchen island. I was going to show Julian the truth. I was going to prove to him that his mother was a corporate monster. I imagined the look of absolute horror that would cross his face when he realized how terribly he had been used. I imagined him pulling me into his arms, apologizing for forcing me to sign that contract and promising to help me fire every single one of those spies and take his mother to court. I waited in the quiet darkness of the kitchen, watching the storm clouds slowly turn the color of bruised purple as dawn broke over the city. I did not sleep. I did not move. I just drank cold coffee and stared at the pile of paper that held the key to saving my company. At 6 a.m, I heard the heavy thud of the front door opening. Julian walked into the house, shaking the rain from his expensive wool coat. He looked incredibly rested, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and roasted garlic from whatever luxurious dinner he had enjoyed the night before. He strolled into the kitchen, loosening his silk tie, and stopped when he saw me sitting motionless at the marble island. He asked me why I was awake so early, his tone casual, almost bored. He walked over to the espresso machine and began grinding fresh beans. He did not look at my face. He did not notice the exhaustion radiating from my bones or the redness of my eyes. I stood up slowly. My legs felt like lead. I pushed the thick stack of highlighted documents across the cool marble surface toward him. I told him he needed to look at them immediately. Julian let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. He complained that it was barely sunrise and he was not in the mood to look at warehouse budgets. He told me to leave it on his desk at the office. I raised my voice, the sound cracking sharply in the quiet kitchen. I told him it was not a budget report. I told him I knew exactly who the 19 consultants were. Julian froze. The espresso machine whirred loudly behind him, filling the tense silence of the room. He slowly turned around, wiping his hands on a linen towel. His eyes dropped to the documents spread across the counter. He saw the Delaware registry records. He saw the highlighted names connecting his new hires to the Brooks Investment Fund. He saw the printed access logs showing the proprietary algorithm being forwarded to his mother's servers. I watched his face closely, waiting for the shock. I waited for the confusion, the betrayal, the sudden realization that his own mother had played him for a fool. I stepped around the counter, reaching out to touch his arm. I told him his mother had lied to both of us. I explained how she was using the new staff to steal our trade secrets and bleed the company dry. I told him we needed to call our corporate lawyers right away, lock down the servers, and have security remove every single one of those 19 people before the workday started. My voice was frantic, desperate, pleading with him to join my side of the war. Julian looked at my trembling hand resting on his sleeve. Then very slowly he looked up and met my eyes. There was no horror in his expression. There was no confusion. There was absolutely no surprise. Julian let out a low, breathy chuckle. It was a cold, chilling sound that made the blood freeze completely solid in my veins. He casually picked up the top sheet of paper, glanced at my meticulous red highlights, and dropped it back onto the marble island with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He reached up and adjusted the collar of his tailored shirt. He told me I had certainly been busy for someone who claimed to have a migraine. He leaned back against the counter, crossed his arms over his chest, and looked at me with a level of condescension I had never seen before. He did not look like a husband who had just discovered a massive corporate betrayal. He looked like a chess player who had just watched his opponent make a terribly predictable move. I stood paralyzed, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. I asked him why he was not angry. I asked him if he understood what his mother was doing to my father's legacy. Julian let out another amused sigh. He reached for his left hand. With slow, deliberate movements, he slid his gold wedding band off his finger. The metal clinked sharply as he tossed it onto the marble island right on top of my stack of evidence. The ring spun for a brief second before coming to a complete stop directly over Thomas's name. Julian picked up his freshly brewed espresso, took a long, relaxed sip, and looked at me with utterly dead eyes. "You really are as naive as my mother said." The gold band clattered against the marble countertop, a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the freezing kitchen. It spun for a fraction of a second before settling perfectly still right over the names of the corporate spies I had just uncovered. I stared at the ring, the ultimate symbol of my marriage, now discarded like a piece of meaningless trash. I looked up at Julian. The man standing across from me was not my husband. His posture was completely relaxed. His breathing was slow and even. He took another sip of his espresso, his eyes casually scanning my face, waiting for me to shatter. I demanded to know what he meant. I asked him how he could stand there completely unbothered while I held the absolute proof that his mother was destroying my father's legacy. I expected him to panic. I expected him to scramble for excuses, to invent a lie, to beg for my understanding. Instead, Julian set his ceramic cup down and let out a heavy, tired sigh. He looked at me with the weary expression of a teacher dealing with a particularly slow student. He said it was finally time to stop pretending. He told me the charade had run its course, and frankly, he was exhausted from playing the role of the supportive, loving partner. He walked slowly around the kitchen island, trailing his hand along the expensive granite edge. He told me I had always possessed a tragic, blinding flaw. I believed the world ran on hard work and loyalty, just like my father did. But the real world, Julian explained, ran on real estate and leverage. He stopped a few feet away from me. He said his mother never cared about the logistics business. She did not care about our trucks, our supply chains, or our warehouse employees. She cared about the dirt those warehouses were sitting on. The truth hit me like a physical punch to the gut. Sterling Logistics occupied 20 acres of prime undeveloped waterfront property in the industrial district of Seattle. It was the absolute last parcel of independent land in a highly coveted commercial zone. Julian's voice was completely devoid of emotion as he laid out the facts. He told me his mother's investment group had been trying to acquire that exact parcel for 5 years to build a billion-dollar luxury commercial complex. My father had stubbornly refused to sell. He had repeatedly rejected Beatrice's aggressive buyout offers, insisting the land was the heart of our family business. Since my father would not sell the land, Beatrice decided to steal it from the inside out. I took a stumbling step backward, my back hitting the cold stainless steel of the refrigerator. I asked him if our entire marriage was a setup. Julian did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He smiled a thin, chilling curve of his lips. He confirmed that every single moment of our relationship was a carefully orchestrated acquisition strategy. He told me they needed someone on the inside. They needed a legal pathway into the company's financial structure. They needed a vulnerable, desperate heir they could manipulate. He looked me up and down, his eyes filled with absolute disdain. He said, I was the perfect target. A grieving, overworked daughter, desperate for love and terrified of failing. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms casually. He brought up the early years of our marriage. He brought up the $90,000 in student loan debt I had worked myself to the bone to pay off. I had sacrificed my 20s, skipped meals, and worn frayed coats in the freezing Seattle winters to give him a clean financial slate. Julian laughed a dry, cruel sound. He said those loans were real, but his inability to pay them was a complete fabrication. His mother could have wiped that debt away with a single check. They let me pay it off simply to keep me financially depleted, exhausted, and entirely dependent on his emotional validation. He said watching me pack peanut butter sandwiches while I paid for his expensive suits was the most pathetic thing he had ever witnessed. I felt a wave of intense nausea roll through my stomach. I gripped the edge of the counter, fighting the urge to collapse. I asked him about my father's death. I asked him if they had something to do with the heart attack. Julian rolled his eyes, calling me dramatic. He said my father's death was just a convenient biological coincidence. But once my dad was out of the picture, Beatrice accelerated the timeline. They instructed their corporate allies to call in our short-term debts. They used their banking influence to freeze our credit lines. They manufactured the entire financial crisis to force me into signing over 30% of the equity. And with that equity, Julian had the legal authority to bring in the 19 corporate spies masquerading as consultants. He explained their roles with chilling efficiency. The spies were not just bleeding our accounts. They were intentionally sabotaging our safety records. They were alienating our vendors. They were forwarding our proprietary bids to Beatrice's shell companies so she could steal our largest clients. Julian stated that by the end of the fiscal quarter, Sterling Logistics would be completely insolvent. The company would be forced into a fire sale bankruptcy. Beatrice's fund would swoop in as the majority stakeholder, acquire the remaining assets for pennies on the dollar, bulldoze the warehouses, and break ground on her commercial empire. And I would be left with absolutely nothing. A fierce burning rage began to replace the nausea in my stomach. The tears I had been holding back completely evaporated. I stood up straight, meeting his cold gaze with a sudden, furious energy. I told him he had made a fatal mistake. I told him I had the heavy black ledger. I had the printed access logs. I had the Delaware registry records proving his consultants were spies. I pointed to the stack of highlighted papers on the island. I promised him I was taking every single piece of evidence straight to the corporate board, to the local authorities, and to a ruthless litigation attorney. I swore I would have him and his mother thrown in federal prison for corporate sabotage. Julian did not flinch. He did not look scared. He simply reached into his tailored slacks and pulled out his smartphone. He unlocked the screen and tapped it a few times before sliding it across the marble counter toward me. He suggested I check my banking applications before making any grandiose threats about hiring expensive litigation attorneys. My hands shook violently as I pulled my own phone from my pocket. I opened my primary banking app, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stared at the screen. The joint savings account I had poured my entire life into, the account that held over $400,000 in emergency funds, showed a balance of 0. I rapidly checked our checking accounts. 0. I checked the secondary investment portfolios. They were completely drained. Julian watched my face drain of color, clearly enjoying every second of my terror. He explained the harsh, unforgiving mechanics of joint financial assets. Because my name and his name were equally on the accounts, he had the legal right to transfer the funds without my explicit consent. In the middle of the night, while I was sitting in a diner with my loyal accountant, Julian had wired every single penny of our life savings into an irrevocable offshore trust entirely controlled by the Brooks Investment Fund. The money was legally shielded. It was untouchable. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his expensive leather wallet, and extracted 3 plastic cards. He tossed them onto the counter next to his discarded wedding ring. They were my corporate credit cards and my personal emergency cards. He told me he had spent the early morning hours on the phone with the issuers. He had reported the cards as compromised and frozen the accounts. Because he was the primary account holder on the personal lines and the authorized financial proxy on the corporate lines, the banks had complied immediately. I was completely financially paralyzed. I had no cash to hire a lawyer. I had no credit to pay for an investigation. I could not even buy a tank of gas. I was a chief operating officer of a multi-million-dollar logistics company, and my husband had just rendered me utterly destitute before the sun even fully rose. Julian leaned forward, resting his hands on the counter. He spoke in a low, measured voice, delivering his final, brutal ultimatum. He told me I had exactly 48 hours to make a choice. If I signed over the remaining 70% of the company to his mother by the end of the week, they would show me a tiny shred of mercy. They would give me a modest severance package enough to rent a cheap apartment. They would allow me to walk away with a quiet, uncontested divorce. I would lose the company, but I would not lose my freedom. But if I refused, if I tried to take my little stack of highlighted papers to the authorities, he would absolutely destroy me. He promised to leave me entirely buried under the massive mounting corporate debt they had manufactured. He said his mother's legal team would drag the bankruptcy proceedings out for years. They would ensure I was held personally liable for the financial collapse of Sterling Logistics. He would leave me homeless, bankrupt, and drowning in lawsuits for the rest of my natural life. He looked at me with a smile so cruel it made my skin crawl. He said I was a smart girl and he fully expected me to make the smart, practical choice. Julian did not wait for an answer. He picked up his espresso cup, took one final sip and set it delicately in the sink. He grabbed his tailored wool coat from the back of the dining chair. He told me to pack my personal belongings from the master bedroom by the time he returned from work. He walked out of the kitchen, his footsteps echoing down the hardwood hallway. I heard the front door open, the rush of the cold Seattle rain, and the heavy, definitive click of the deadbolt sliding into place. I was left entirely alone in the massive dark house. The storm outside raged on, beating relentlessly against the tall glass windows. For a long time I could not move. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal pressed down on me like a physical weight, crushing the air out of my lungs. I sank to the kitchen floor, my knees hitting the cold hardwood. I pulled my arms around my chest and finally let myself completely break down. I sobbed until my throat was raw. I cried for my father, who had literally worked himself to death to build a legacy that was currently being butchered. I cried for my loyal employees who were about to lose their jobs simply because I had fallen in love with a monster. I cried for the decade of my life I had wasted, the dreams I had deferred, and the future that had just been violently erased. I had been nothing but a pawn in a rich family's real estate game. I felt incredibly small, incredibly foolish, and entirely hopeless. But as I sat there on the floor, surrounded by the silence of a stolen life, the tears eventually stopped falling. The hollow, aching sorrow in my chest began to harden. It solidified into something sharp, cold, and immensely powerful. I thought about Beatrice Brooks sitting in her glass tower in Chicago, feeling utterly invincible. I thought about Julian tossing his wedding ring onto the counter, looking at me like I was a pathetic, easily manipulated victim. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought taking my money and my authority would force me to surrender. They made a massive miscalculation. They forgot that I was a financial controller who knew every single operational artery of that logistics company. They forgot that my father had taught me how to survive in the brutal, unforgiving world of freight and supply chains. I slowly stood up from the floor. My legs were no longer shaking. I walked over to the kitchen island and picked up Julian's discarded wedding ring. I dropped it straight into the garbage disposal and flipped the switch, listening to the loud, grinding crunch of the metal. I wiped the remaining tears from my face. I looked down at the heavy black ledger and the highlighted access logs. Julian was right about one thing. I was a smart girl, and I was going to use every single ounce of my intelligence to burn their entire empire to the absolute ground. Monday morning hit Seattle with a bitter, biting frost. I stood in my father's office, tracing the grain of his heavy oak desk for what I knew would be the last time in a long while. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of the lobby parted. Beatrice Brooks had flown in from Chicago. She did not simply walk into Sterling Logistics. She invaded it. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car, her heels clicking against the tile like a ticking metronome. Flanking her were two massive private security contractors, followed closely by Julian. My husband looked entirely in his element, walking a half step behind his mother, holding a sleek leather briefcase and looking at my employees like they were dirt under his expensive shoes. The entire warehouse floor went dead silent. The roar of the forklifts ceased. Dispatchers stopped talking. Beatrice marched straight past the reception desk without so much as a glance at the terrified staff and headed directly for the executive wing. I did not hide. I stood in the doorway of my office, bracing myself for the impact. Beatrice stopped 3 feet away from me. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my inexpensive blouse with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. She did not bother to lower her voice. She wanted an audience. She announced to the entire floor that due to severe financial mismanagement and a dangerous lack of leadership, the Brooks Investment Fund was stepping in to take emergency operational control of Sterling Logistics. Julian stepped forward, snapping his briefcase open. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and handed it to me. It was a formal corporate demotion. He stated that effective immediately, my title as Chief Operating Officer was entirely revoked. I was being reassigned to a junior data entry position until the advisory board could determine if my continued employment was even necessary. He told me security would now escort me to my new workspace, and I had exactly 10 minutes to clear my personal belongings out of the executive suite. Every instinct in my body screamed to fight back. I wanted to throw the paper right in his face. I wanted to scream to the paralyzed employees that the woman standing before them was a corporate parasite trying to steal their livelihoods. But I remembered the black ledger hidden in my closet. I remembered the offshore trust that held my life savings. I realized that if I fought them now, they would simply fire me on the spot, lock me out of the building forever, and I would lose my absolute only chance to gather the digital evidence I desperately needed. So I swallowed my fierce pride, bit my tongue, and gave them exactly the show they wanted. I let my shoulders slump. I forced my hands to shake violently. I looked at Julian and let the genuine exhaustion of the past 6 months pool into my eyes, easily producing a stream of thick, desperate tears. I begged him. I sobbed openly in front of the security guards and the warehouse staff. I grabbed his arm, crying that he could not do this to me, that my father had just died, that I had given him everything I had. I pleaded with Beatrice, telling her I would do whatever she wanted, asking her please not to take my father's office away from me. It was the absolute most humiliating performance of my entire life, but it worked flawlessly. Beatrice practically purred with satisfaction. Her chest puffed out. This was the exact power dynamic she had always craved. She looked at me, weeping, completely broken, and finally saw the pathetic, uneducated, blue-collar girl she had always believed me to be. She told me to gather my pathetic little knickknacks and get out of her sight. Julian actually sneered. He brushed my hand off his sleeve like I was carrying a highly contagious disease. He told me to stop embarrassing myself and just go to my cubicle before he decided to have me thrown out into the freezing rain. 2 massive security guards marched me down the hallway carrying my small cardboard box of belongings. They led me away from the expansive windowed offices of the executive wing, marching me deep into the bowels of the administrative floor. They stopped at a tiny windowless cubicle tucked away in a damp, poorly lit corner next to the employee break room. The desk was covered in a thick layer of dust. The chair was broken. It was a place deliberately designed for someone who did not matter. I sat down in the broken chair, burying my face in my hands, letting my shoulders heave as if I were absolutely inconsolable. I heard the hushed, pitying whispers of the staff walking past. I heard Julian and Beatrice laughing loudly down the hall as they settled into my father's sanctuary. They were popping champagne. They were celebrating their total victory over the naive, stupid wife who had simply handed them the keys to the castle. I kept my face buried in my hands for a full hour, but beneath my fingers my tears had completely dried up. My expression was perfectly calm. I listened to the sounds of the office. I listened to the arrogant, heavy footsteps of the 19 corporate spies pacing the floors, entirely confident that they had won. They thought they had completely neutralized the only threat to their operation. They thought I was a technologically illiterate bean counter who would sit in a dark corner and quietly weep until they finally fired me. They had absolutely no idea who my father really was. My dad was a brilliant logistics man, but he was also deeply fundamentally paranoid about digital security. Years ago, when we first transitioned the company's dispatch and financial records to cloud-based servers, my father had vehemently objected. He did not trust invisible networks. He did not trust off-site hosting. To appease his old-school sensibilities, our former IT director had built a physical, completely offline legacy server. It was a massive, archaic piece of hardware bolted directly into the concrete floor of the basement storage room. It ran parallel to the modern cloud network, silently recording, backing up, and mirroring every single piece of digital traffic that moved through the Sterling Logistics building. Julian's fancy, expensive new IT director, Greg, was a thoroughly modern corporate hacker. He understood cloud architecture, remote access, and encrypted firewalls perfectly. But he was far too arrogant to ever inspect a damp, dusty basement filled with rusted truck parts and old filing cabinets. Greg had completely secured the cloud, but he had left the physical nervous system of the company entirely exposed. I waited in my dingy cubicle until the digital clock on my desktop read 7 in the evening. The bustling noise of the warehouse had faded into a dull, quiet hum. The administrative staff had gone home for the night. Julian and Beatrice had left hours ago, probably to celebrate their hostile takeover at some 5-star restaurant downtown. The only people left in the building were a few night shift dispatchers on the complete opposite end of the facility. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked quietly toward the maintenance stairwell. I bypassed the elevators, knowing Greg had likely installed keycard trackers on them. I descended 2 flights of concrete stairs, the air growing colder and damper with every step. I reached the heavy steel door of the basement storage room. My father had given me the physical brass key on the day he made me a financial controller. I slid the key into the deadbolt, turned it, and slipped inside. The room was pitch black and smelled heavily of motor oil and damp cardboard. I did not turn on the overhead lights. Instead, I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket and navigated through the maze of discarded office furniture and old engine parts. In the very back corner, hidden behind a tall stack of broken wooden pallets, sat the legacy server. It was a hulking black metal tower, humming with a low, steady vibration. I pulled up a cracked plastic stool and flipped open the heavy monitor attached to the console. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh blue glow across my face. A simple command prompt blinked rhythmically, waiting for input. I typed in the backdoor administrative credentials my father had memorized and passed down only to me. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second before granting me total unrestricted master access. I was completely bypassing Greg's fancy corporate firewalls. I was directly tapped into the raw, unfiltered data stream of the entire company. I quickly ran a targeted diagnostic search, isolating the specific IP addresses and internal routing numbers Thomas had provided in his hidden ledger. I filtered the search to track the exact digital footprints of the 19 spies Julian had hired. What I saw on the screen made my jaw clench with fierce, undeniable vindication. Greg's team had been incredibly sloppy. They believed their external encryption was foolproof because they thought nobody inside Sterling Logistics possessed the technical clearance to monitor outgoing traffic. But the legacy server did not care about external encryption. It recorded the raw data packets the exact moment they left the internal network before the encryption ever had a chance to scramble the files. I watched in real time as thousands of files were systematically packaged and routed to external servers located in Chicago. I opened the packet logs. There were daily reports containing our exact proprietary fuel surcharge algorithms. There were comprehensive lists of our upcoming contract renewals with major retail suppliers. There were internal memos detailing which of our transport trucks were scheduled for maintenance, allowing the spies to perfectly time their sabotage and ensure our deliveries would fail. I plugged a high-capacity external hard drive into the server port. My fingers flew across the keyboard executing a mass download protocol. The progress bar flashed on the screen calculating the immense volume of data. 5,000 files, 10,000 files, 15,000 files. I was ripping the entire history of their corporate espionage straight from the belly of the beast. As the data transferred, I started opening some of the intercepted internal communications between the spies and Beatrice's headquarters. I needed to see exactly how they were coordinating the destruction of my company. But as I read through the decrypted subject lines, the cold satisfaction in my chest suddenly turned into a sharp, terrifying realization. I opened an email sent by Amanda, the new director of risk management, addressed directly to the chief financial officer of the Brooks Investment Fund. The email was not about sabotaging our freight routes or stealing our clients. It contained a highly detailed, deeply complex spreadsheet mapping out millions of dollars moving through dummy vendor accounts. I cross-referenced the vendor names with our internal payment ledgers. None of these vendors actually existed. Sterling Logistics was paying out massive six-figure invoices for phantom truck parts, ghost fuel deliveries, and non-existent warehouse consulting services. The money was leaving our accounts, passing through a maze of regional shell companies, and ultimately landing in an offshore holding account perfectly tied to Beatrice Brooks. My hands started to shake, not from grief or fear, but from the sheer staggering magnitude of the crime I had just stumbled upon. Beatrice and Julian were not just trying to bankrupt my father's company so they could buy the prime real estate. That was only a fraction of their grand scheme. I watched the progress bar hit 100%. The download was complete. I pulled the hard drive from the server, slipping it deep into the pocket of my blazer. I powered down the monitor, plunging the damp basement back into total darkness. I stood in the pitch-black room, listening to the low hum of the servers, realizing that the war had just fundamentally changed. I was no longer fighting a simple corporate takeover. I had just walked away with the digital evidence of a massive federal financial crime, and I was going to use every single bite of it to destroy them. The heavy metal door of the basement storage room clicked shut behind me, plunging me back into the dimly lit, damp concrete hallway of Sterling Logistics. I stood there for a long moment, the cold plastic of the external hard drive burning a hole against my ribs through the fabric of my blazer. I had descended those stairs as a humiliated, broken wife trying to salvage the scraps of her father's legacy. I walked back up them as the only witness to a sprawling multi-million-dollar federal syndicate. I did not go home to the freezing, silent house I shared with the man who had actively orchestrated my destruction. I could not bear to look at the walls we had painted together, or the furniture I had bought with my hard-earned paycheck, while he drained our joint accounts. Instead, I drove to a cheap, cash-only motel off the interstate. I sat at a wobbly laminate desk under the harsh glare of a flickering fluorescent bulb, locked the deadbolt, and plugged the hard drive into my laptop. The rain outside lashed against the thin glass window, but the noise was entirely drowned out by the roaring in my ears as I began to truly understand the sheer magnitude of Beatrice Brooks' criminal enterprise. Thomas had been right about the ghost employees bleeding our operating budget dry, but he had only seen the absolute surface of the infection. The deeper I dug into the intercepted communications between Julian's consultants and the Brooks Investment Fund in Chicago, the more the horrifying picture came into perfect, undeniable focus. Beatrice was not just a corporate raider looking to force a fire sale and steal my father's prime waterfront real estate. She was using my logistics network as the central nervous system for a massive, highly illegal insider trading ring. Sterling Logistics handled regional supply chain distribution for some of the largest, most profitable tech manufacturers and retail giants in the Pacific Northwest. We knew exactly when high-value inventory was moving. We knew when major product launches were facing critical supply shortages because we were the ones reporting the container weights and the delayed shipping manifests. Beatrice had instructed her 19 planted spies to build a direct pipeline of this highly confidential data straight to her trading floor. I pulled up the encrypted spreadsheets and cross-referenced the dates of our intercepted shipping delays with public stock market records. The correlation was mathematically absolute and deeply terrifying. Weeks before a major electronics corporation was forced to publicly announce a disastrous quarterly loss due to supply chain failures, Beatrice had used our stolen internal logistics data to aggressively short their stock. When a massive retail client of ours quietly doubled their shipping volume ahead of a surprise holiday promotion, Beatrice bought thousands of call options just days before their stock price skyrocketed. She was front-running the entire market using my father's honest, hard-working trucks and warehouses to predict corporate earnings before Wall Street even had a clue. It was securities fraud on a scale that would make federal prosecutors salivate. But the absolute worst part, the part that made my blood run cold and my hands shake with a violent, righteous fury, was how she washed the dirty money. The phantom vendor invoices I had discovered, the ones billing Sterling Logistics for non-existent truck parts and ghost fuel deliveries, were not just a method to bankrupt my company. Beatrice was taking her illicit, untaxed insider trading profits, routing them through a complex web of anonymous shell corporations, and cycling them back through my payroll system as legitimate business expenses. She was using the company my father had built with his bare, calloused hands as a giant automated washing machine for her federal crimes. And Julian, the man who had stood at an altar and promised to protect me for the rest of my life, was the architect who had built her the back door. I closed my laptop as the pale gray light of dawn began to bleed through the cheap motel curtains. I knew exactly what I had to do, but taking down a billionaire corporate raider required immense capital. Julian thought he had completely paralyzed me. He had drained our joint savings, zeroed out our checking accounts, and frozen every single credit card attached to my name. He believed he had left me with absolutely no resources, a desperate woman who would be forced to sign over the remaining 70% of my company just to afford a place to sleep. He was wrong. He had forgotten one crucial detail about my life before I met him. Before my mother passed away from a brutal battle with cancer when I was 19, she had called me into her hospital room and handed me a small, worn leather passbook. She came from a generation of women who understood that financial dependence was the most dangerous trap a woman could ever fall into. She told me that no matter who I married, no matter how much I loved him, a woman always needed an escape fund, a quiet, invisible piece of autonomy that no man could ever touch. Over the past 12 years, I had honored her dying wish. I had quietly deposited small sums, modest graduation gifts, tax refunds, and little portions of my bonuses into a private high-yield trust account at a small local credit union on the other side of town. Julian had never seen the statements. He had no idea the account even existed. It was not billionaire money. It was just shy of $85,000. But as I walked into the credit union the next morning and requested a certified cashier's check for the entire balance, I knew it was more than enough to buy a very sharp, very heavy sword. I did not go to a standard family attorney or a polite business mediator. I took my mother's money and hired Diane Vance, a terrifyingly brilliant corporate litigator who had built her entire reputation on ripping predatory hedge funds to shreds. I brought her the hard drive. I sat in her sleek, high-rise office and watched her sharp, calculating eyes scan the access logs, the phantom invoices, and the perfectly timed stock trades. When she finally looked up at me, her smile was completely predatory. She told me we were not just going to sue Julian and Beatrice for corporate sabotage. We were going to hand the federal government the biggest financial crime bust of the decade on a silver platter. Diane immediately brought in a boutique firm of forensic accountants, composed entirely of former federal investigators. For the next 3 weeks, I lived a bizarre, grueling double life. During the day, I drove to the Sterling Logistics building and assumed my new role in the dusty, windowless cubicle Julian had banished me to. I played the part of the broken, defeated wife to absolute perfection. I intentionally wore wrinkled blouses. I let my hair sit flat and unstyled. I spent hours doing meaningless, repetitive data entry, keeping my head down while the 19 corporate spies swaggered past my desk. Whenever Julian or Beatrice walked through the administrative floor flaunting their hostile takeover and barking orders at my terrified staff, I made sure to let my shoulders tremble. I would force tears to well up in my eyes and quickly wipe them away, acting exactly like the pathetic, shattered woman they needed me to be. They basked in their perceived victory, utterly convinced that I had given up. They grew completely arrogant, incredibly sloppy, and entirely blind to the trap closing around them. But the second the clock struck 5, the weeping victim vanished. I would drive straight to a secure, windowless war room. Diane had rented under a dummy corporation name. I spent every single night surrounded by towering whiteboards, empty coffee cups, and brilliant financial analysts. We meticulously traced every single wire transfer Beatrice had pushed through my father's company. We mapped out the exact digital architecture of her shell companies. We tied Julian's personal signature authorizations directly to the fraudulent invoices. We built a staggering bulletproof 500-page dossier that connected the hostile takeover of Sterling Logistics to a massive multi-state racketeering and securities fraud syndicate. The exhaustion was absolute and bone-deep. I was sleeping barely 3 hours a night on a small cot in the corner of the war room. I was living on black coffee and adrenaline. But every time I felt like I could not look at another spreadsheet, I thought about the sheer arrogant cruelty on Julian's face when he tossed his wedding ring onto the marble counter. I thought about Beatrice sneering at my father's legacy. That righteous burning anger fueled me through the darkest hours of the night. Finally, on a crisp Thursday morning, the weapon was complete. I stood in a sterile, heavily secured conference room at the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Sitting across the steel table from me were 2 senior agents from the White-Collar Crimes Division and a highly specialized investigator from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Diane sat beside me completely silent, allowing me to take the lead. I slid the massive, heavily indexed binder across the polished metal table. I looked the lead federal agent dead in the eye and told him exactly how the Brooks Investment Fund was using a hostile corporate takeover to launder millions of dollars in illegal insider trading profits. I watched the agent open the binder. I watched his eyes trace the undeniable, mathematically verified connections between Beatrice's stock options and my company's intercepted shipping manifests. The atmosphere in the room shifted from polite skepticism to absolute electrifying tension. The SEC investigator actually leaned forward, his breathing suddenly shallow, as he realized I had just handed them a fully packaged, irrefutable case against one of the most elusive corporate raiders, SPIES, the Midwest. They asked me if I was willing to testify on the record. I told them I was willing to burn the entire operation to the ground. The trap was officially set. The federal warrants were being quietly drafted behind closed doors. All I had to do was wait for the perfect moment to trigger the explosion. I drove back to Sterling Logistics that afternoon, slipping back into my dusty cubicle near the break room. I hunched over my keyboard, pretending to struggle with a simple spreadsheet hiding the fierce, triumphant glow in my eyes. The warehouse floor was tense, the employees whispering nervously about the aggressive new protocols Julian's team was enforcing. I wanted to pull every single one of them aside and tell them to hold on just a little bit longer. I wanted to tell them that the nightmare was almost over. Just before 5 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of the administrative wing opened. A private courier stepped onto the floor, dressed in a sharp black uniform carrying a large, rigid envelope. He bypassed the reception desk entirely, following the specific instructions he had been given, and walked straight back to my miserable, isolated corner. He handed me the envelope without a word and turned away. The paper was thick, expensive, and heavy in my hands. It was sealed with a dark red wax stamp bearing the ornate swirling crest of the Brooks family. I broke the wax and pulled out a lavish gold-foiled invitation. It was an exclusive summons to the annual Brooks Family Charity Gala, the most elite, heavily publicized networking event for the ultra-wealthy investors and socialites of the Seattle area. Attached to the gilded invitation with a stark silver paperclip was a small handwritten note on Beatrice's personal stationery. The cursive writing was elegant, sharp, and dripping with absolute condescension. The note commanded me to attend the gala on Saturday night. It stated that the transition period was officially over and my presence was required to put an end to the ridiculous, lingering tension. Beatrice demanded that I bring the final legally binding equity transfer papers to the ballroom. She wanted me to sign over the remaining 70% of my father's company in front of the most powerful people in the city, officially surrendering my legacy as a public display of total submission. If I failed to show up with the signed papers, the note promised that Julian would initiate the immediate hostile bankruptcy liquidation on Monday morning, leaving me completely destitute. I sat in the broken chair staring at the arrogant, commanding handwriting. Beatrice wanted a public spectacle. She wanted to humiliate the working-class daughter in front of her high society peers. She wanted me to hand over my father's life work on a silver platter while she smiled for the cameras. A slow, cold smile spread across my face in the shadows of the cubicle. I carefully folded the invitation and slipped it into my purse. I was going to give Beatrice Brooks exactly the spectacular, unforgettable public show she was demanding. I stared at the heavy gold-foiled invitation resting on the cheap laminate surface of my dusty cubicle desk. The Brooks Family Charity Gala was not just a simple social event. In the wealthy echelons of Seattle, it was an absolute coronation. Held every year in the sprawling grand ballroom of the Olympic Fairmont Hotel, it was the specific night where the oldest money in the city gathered to drink $1,000 champagne and pretend their immense wealth was built on generous philanthropy instead of ruthless exploitation. Beatrice Brooks did not just want to steal my father's company. She wanted to orchestrate my absolute, undeniable submission. The handwritten note she had attached to the invitation with a sterling silver paperclip was a total masterpiece of psychological warfare. Beatrice wanted me to stand on a brightly lit stage in front of 400 venture capitalists, tech billionaires, and real estate moguls. She wanted me to physically sign over the remaining 70% of Sterling Logistics with an audience watching. She intended for the city's financial elite to witness the blue-collar daughter of a truck driver surrender her legacy to the superior intellect of the Brooks Empire. It was a carefully designed spectacle meant to completely break my spirit, ensuring I would be far too humiliated to ever dare file a lawsuit against them in the future. I picked up my cell phone, walked quietly out of the administrative wing, and locked myself inside a vacant janitorial closet on the second floor. I dialed my corporate litigator, Diane Vance. I read the arrogant note aloud to her, fully expecting my lawyer to be furious at the sheer audacity of the demand. Instead, I heard the sharp, distinct sound of Diane laughing through the receiver. She told me Beatrice had just made a fatal tactical error. By demanding a highly publicized exact time and location for the final signing, my mother-in-law had just handed us the perfect distracted stage we needed to execute a coordinated federal raid. The next 72 hours transformed into a masterclass in controlled panic. I left the warehouse that evening and drove straight to the secure, windowless war room Diane had rented in a downtown high-rise. The atmosphere inside the room had completely changed since my last visit. The massive whiteboards were no longer just covered in corporate organizational charts. They were now displaying live digital tracking maps provided directly by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The lead federal investigator, a sharply dressed man with incredibly tired eyes, asked me to sit down. He delivered a piece of news that made the blood run absolutely cold in my veins. The forensic accountants we hired had breached another layer of the encrypted emails I had stolen from the basement server. They had detected a massive automated shift scheduled in Beatrice's shadow financial networks, Beatrice was preparing to funnel over $30 million of illegal laundered insider trading profits into an entirely untraceable account located in the Cayman Islands. The investigator leaned across the metal table, his expression grave. He explained the terrifying stakes of our timeline. The massive offshore wire transfer was digitally programmed to execute at exactly 10 o'clock on Saturday night. That was the exact same time the keynote speeches were scheduled to begin at the charity gala. Beatrice was purposely using her own lavish, highly publicized party as an operational smokescreen. While she was smiling for the society cameras, shaking hands with senators, and forcing me to sign away my father's company on a glittering stage, her automated servers downtown would be quietly washing the dirty money completely out of federal jurisdiction. The agent pointed to a red timer ticking down on his laptop screen. He stated that Beatrice had installed a ruthless security protocol on her main servers. The absolute second those funds cleared international waters, the local servers at the Brooks Investment Fund would instantly trigger a hard wipe. Every single piece of digital evidence proving her insider trading her ghost employees and her systematic destruction of Sterling Logistics would be permanently deleted. If that transfer went through before the federal agents could physically breach her headquarters and manually sever the network cables, the paper trail would vanish into thin air. Beatrice would walk away completely clean. Julian would be a newly minted multimillionaire. I would be left holding the legal liability for a bankrupt logistics company utterly ruined by corporate spies. The margin for error was exactly zero. We had to intercept the transfer while Beatrice was completely distracted on stage. Friday at the office was the most agonizing psychological test of my entire life. I had to continue playing the role of the defeated, humiliated wife to absolute perfection. I sat in my windowless cubicle wearing a wrinkled, oversized sweater, mechanically typing data into a meaningless spreadsheet. I kept my shoulders hunched and my eyes cast downward. Julian swaggered past my workstation twice before lunch. He paused the second time, leaning casually over my plastic partition. He smelled strongly of expensive cologne and misplaced arrogance. He tapped his knuckles against my desk to get my attention. He reminded me to wear something appropriate for Saturday night, explicitly suggesting I purchase a dress that did not look like it was salvaged from a discount clearance rack. He told me that his mother expected a seamless professional handover, and he warned me not to embarrass him in front of his wealthy colleagues. I kept my eyes glued to my keyboard. I forced my voice to waver just enough to sound thoroughly broken and compliant. I promised him I would be there, and swore I would not cause a scene. Julian let out a soft, patronizing sigh. He told me I was finally learning how the real world worked. I watched him walk away toward the executive suites, feeling a fierce, burning heat radiating in my chest. He was marching blindly toward his own absolute destruction, completely unaware that the pathetic woman he was mocking held the keys to his federal indictment. Saturday morning arrived with a crisp, bitter chill in the Seattle air. I did not go anywhere near the office. I threw away the cheap, frumpy blouses I had been wearing all week to maintain my victim disguise. I took a cab to a high-end designer boutique in the city center, using the very last remaining balance of my secret emergency fund. I did not buy a submissive, quiet dress meant to blend into the background. I was not attending this gala as a defeated wife or a broken daughter. I bought a gown that demanded every single ounce of attention in a room. It was a stunning floor-length silk dress in a shade of deep, unapologetic blood red. It featured a sharp, structured neckline and a sweeping train. It was not just clothing. It was armor. It was a blinding red flag meant to draw every eye in the grand ballroom directly to me. I spent the entire afternoon at a luxury salon. I had my hair professionally styled into sleek, powerful waves that cascaded over my shoulders. I instructed the makeup artist to give me a sharp, dramatic look, highlighting the fierce, unyielding determination I had been hiding for 6 months. When I finally stood up and looked in the full-length mirror, the terrified, grieving widow who had signed that predatory contract was completely gone. The woman staring back at me was a corporate executioner. At exactly 7 o'clock, I sat in the spacious back seat of a rented black town car, heading toward the Olympic Fairmont Hotel. My designer clutch held exactly 2 items. The first was a thick, pristine manila folder containing the blank equity transfer documents Beatrice had aggressively demanded. The second was an untraceable encrypted burner phone Diane had provided to me the night before. I watched the glittering lights of the Seattle skyline pass by the tinted windows, my thumb resting lightly on the cold plastic of the burner phone. The entire tactical board was already set in motion. The federal agents were quietly moving into position across the city. Heavily armed strike teams from the FBI were currently sitting in unmarked black vans outside the Brooks Investment Fund headquarters, waiting in the dark for the absolute precise second to breach the server rooms. A secondary team of undercover SEC investigators was quietly staging in the service hallways of the hotel ballroom dressed as catering staff and security personnel. Everything hinged entirely on my ability to execute the final, most dangerous part of the plan. I had to keep Beatrice and Julian completely engaged and entirely distracted in the center of that ballroom. I had to drag out the signing ceremony, commanding their full attention, preventing them from checking their phones or contacting their IT department until the federal agents successfully secured the offshore transfer codes. If I rushed the confrontation, Beatrice might realize something was wrong and trigger the manual server wipe from her phone. If I stalled too long, the automated transfer would hit the Cayman Islands and we would lose the entire case. The town car slowly pulled into the grand sweeping entrance of the luxury hotel. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and highly reflective. Flashbulbs from local society photographers immediately illuminated the dark night, capturing the arrival of tech moguls, politicians, and real estate tycoons. Valets in crisp gold-trimmed uniforms rushed forward to open doors for the city's most powerful elite. The encrypted burner phone vibrated sharply inside my clutch. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a single, highly secure text message from the lead FBI agent stationed outside Beatrice's corporate headquarters. The message simply stated that all breach teams were holding their final positions, the perimeter was locked, and they were waiting for my green light. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my purse. I picked up the heavy manila folder containing the fake equity documents. I took one final deep breath, letting the cool, sharp night air fill my lungs and steady my racing heart. I opened the door and stepped out of the black vehicle, my blood-red silk dress instantly catching the bright, blinding flash of the press cameras. I walked up the grand marble steps toward the towering doors of the ballroom, completely ready to drop the guillotine on the family that had tried to bury me. The grand ballroom of the Olympic Fairmont Hotel was a suffocating monument to Seattle's oldest, most untouchable wealth. Walking through the towering, gilded double doors felt like stepping onto a completely alien planet. The air inside the massive room was thick with the scent of $1,000 perfume and the sharp, crisp bite of chilled champagne. 4 massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm, golden light over 400 of the city's most powerful people. Tech billionaires, venture capitalists, and real estate moguls moved gracefully across the polished marble floor. They spoke in polite, hushed tones, trading millions of dollars in influence between sips of top-tier wine. This was Beatrice Brooks's absolute domain. It was an ecosystem entirely designed to intimidate outsiders. A week ago, simply walking into a room like this would have made my stomach twist into painful, terrified knots. I would have felt incredibly small, out of place, and desperately eager to please my husband and his formidable mother. But the woman who stepped into that ballroom tonight was not the obedient, shattered daughter-in-law they thought they had successfully broken. My blood-red silk gown dragged elegantly across the floor, the color a stark, violent contrast to the endless sea of conservative black tuxedos and muted pastel dresses. Heads turned the absolute second I walked into the room. Conversations paused mid-sentence. I could feel the heavy weight of their judgmental stares tracking my every move, but I did not shrink away. I held my head perfectly high. I kept my posture rigidly straight. My designer clutch rested comfortably in my left hand, holding the encrypted burner phone and the thick manila folder they had demanded. I walked past the towering ice sculptures and the sprawling seafood buffets, offering polite, vacant smiles to the society photographers who snapped my picture. I was a walking, breathing red flag, marching straight into the lion's den, and I embraced every single second of the danger. It did not take long for the predators to spot me. I had barely reached the edge of the sprawling dance floor when Julian and Beatrice materialized from the crowd. They moved in perfect unison, slipping away from a group of wealthy investors and cutting off my path near the grand stage. The stage was already set for the main event, flanked by massive dormant projector screens and a pristine acrylic podium. Julian stepped right into my personal space, attempting to use his physical presence to box me in. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit flawlessly. He looked me up and down, taking in the dramatic waves of my hair, the sharp makeup, and the bold red silk that clung to my figure. For a fleeting fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of genuine confusion cross his face. He had explicitly ordered me to wear something subdued, something that reflected my defeated, bankrupt status. But that confusion quickly dissolved back into his signature arrogant smirk. He leaned in close, the scent of his familiar cologne turning my stomach. He asked me if I thought I was attending a Hollywood premiere. He lowered his voice to a harsh, mocking whisper, stating that dressing up like a cheap distraction would not change the brutal reality of what was about to happen. He told me I looked entirely ridiculous, trying to play the part of a confident woman when everyone in their inner circle already knew I was completely destitute. Beatrice stepped up beside him, sipping leisurely from a crystal flute. She wore an icy silver gown that made her look like a perfectly polished shark. She did not even bother to lower her voice. She looked at me with an expression of profound pity and absolute disgust. She loudly remarked that blue-collar girls always mistook loud colors for actual power. She told me my little display of defiance was pathetic and asked if I was finally ready to accept my place in the real world. 6 months ago, their cruel words would have brought hot tears to my eyes. A week ago, I would have desperately tried to defend myself. Tonight, I simply smiled. It was a sweet, utterly compliant, perfectly submissive smile. I let my shoulders relax purposely, mimicking the defeated posture they expected to see. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the heavy manila folder. The paper felt thick and substantial in my hands. I held it out to Beatrice. I kept my voice soft, intentionally fragile, making sure to sound exactly like a woman who had completely surrendered her will to fight. I told her I brought the paperwork exactly like she asked. Julian snatched the folder out of my hands before his mother could even reach for it. He practically ripped it open, his eyes eagerly scanning the top page. It was a standard legally dense equity transfer document I had blindly printed off the internet. It was completely meaningless, filled with generic corporate jargon. But to Julian and Beatrice, it looked like total victory. They did not read the fine print. They only saw the blank signature lines waiting at the bottom. Julian snapped the folder shut and handed it to his mother with a triumphant, arrogant nod. He looked at me and said he was glad I had finally decided to use whatever tiny bit of common sense I possessed. He told me to go stand quietly by the back exit and wait for them to call my name. Beatrice patted my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. She promised she would make the public signing quick, so I could scurry back to whatever cheap apartment I planned to rent with my meager severance package. I nodded meekly. I told them I understood completely. I turned around and walked exactly where they told me to go, moving toward the shadowed edges of the grand ballroom. I watched them walk away, heading straight for the VIP tables near the stage, absolutely glowing with the intoxicating thrill of their victory. They had let their guard down completely. They believed the war was over. They thought they had entirely neutralized the threat. I found a quiet alcove near the main audiovisual control booth, perfectly positioned in the shadows, but with a clear, unobstructed view of the stage. I slipped the encrypted burner phone out of my clutch. I checked the time. It was 9:45 in the evening. We had exactly 15 minutes before Beatrice's automated servers initiated the massive offshore wire transfer that would wash $30 million of illegal profits into the Cayman Islands. The federal strike teams were currently waiting in the dark outside the Brooks Investment Fund headquarters. Everything had to happen precisely right now. The heavy chatter of the ballroom slowly began to die down. The string quartet stopped playing. The bright overhead chandeliers dimmed significantly, casting a dramatic focused spotlight directly onto the acrylic podium. A sharp melodic chime echoed through the sophisticated sound system, demanding the attention of the 400 wealthy guests. Beatrice Brooks walked up the side steps of the stage, the silver fabric of her gown catching the bright spotlight. She looked incredibly regal, incredibly powerful, and entirely untouchable. She stepped behind the microphone, placing the manila folder carefully on the podium. She smiled warmly at the crowd, the perfect picture of an elegant corporate philanthropist. She tapped the microphone gently. A soft thud echoed through the massive room, ensuring she had absolute silence. The venture capitalists, the politicians, and the business moguls turned their faces toward her entirely captivated. Beatrice began to speak, her voice echoing with a smooth, practiced cadence. She welcomed her esteemed colleagues and dear friends to the annual Brooks Family Charity Gala. She talked about the importance of legacy, the value of hard work, and the absolute necessity of building a brighter, stronger economic future for the city of Seattle. It was a masterful, deeply hypocritical performance. She spoke about ethical business practices while standing on a stage funded entirely by corporate sabotage and illegal insider trading. She transitioned smoothly into the main event. She announced that the Brooks Investment Fund was incredibly proud to reveal a massive new acquisition. She stated that they were officially bringing Sterling Logistics into their corporate family. She used words like synergy, modernization, and strategic growth. She painted a beautiful, completely fabricated picture of how she was stepping in to save a failing, poorly managed, archaic company from total ruin. She told the crowd that this acquisition would clear the path for a revolutionary waterfront development project that would bring thousands of jobs to the city. The audience offered polite, appreciative applause. Julian stood near the front row, holding a glass of champagne, beaming with absolute pride. I stood in the shadows, my thumb hovering over the execution button on the burner phone Diane had given me. The phone was loaded with a specialized override program designed by our forensic tech team. It was directly linked to the hotel's wireless audio-visual network. Beatrice continued to speak, preparing to call me onto the stage for the ultimate public humiliation. She announced that the former management of Sterling Logistics had graciously recognized their own limitations and agreed to a full equity transfer. I did not wait for her to say my name. I pressed the button on the phone. The reaction was instantaneous and absolutely violent. The polite, soft lighting illuminating the stage suddenly cut to pitch black. A loud, sharp burst of static crackled aggressively through the massive speakers, making several guests physically jump in their seats. Beatrice gasped, her voice completely cut off as the microphone died. Julian spilled champagne on his expensive tuxedo, looking around the room in sudden confusion. Before the crowd could even process the sudden darkness, the 3 massive projector screens positioned directly behind the stage flashed to life with a blinding, stark white light. The glow illuminated Beatrice from behind, casting a dark, frantic shadow over the podium. The screens did not display the elegant gilded logo of the Brooks Investment Fund. They displayed a sprawling, highly detailed, irrefutable flowchart of a federal criminal enterprise. At the very top of the massive screens, the words Federal Evidence File, Racketeering and Securities Fraud were printed in bold, undeniable red letters. The entire ballroom let out a collective audible gasp. The sound of 400 incredibly wealthy people simultaneously sucking in their breath was like a vacuum pulling all the oxygen out of the room. I tapped the screen of the burner phone, advancing the slide. The massive projectors seamlessly shifted to a new image. It was a direct, terrifyingly clear map of the money laundering network. The graphic showed exactly how the $30 million in illegal insider trading profits were being washed. The flowchart clearly displayed the names of the dummy corporations. It listed the exact offshore bank routing numbers in the Cayman Islands. It showed the fraudulent vendor invoices linking the dirty money directly back to the payroll systems of Sterling Logistics. The silence in the ballroom completely shattered. A tidal wave of frantic whispers and shocked exclamations ripped through the crowd. I could see prominent politicians physically backing away from the stage, instinctively putting distance between themselves and the massive public display of federal crimes. Tech billionaires who had just clapped for Beatrice were now staring at the screens in absolute horrified fascination. Beatrice spun around her high heels, catching on the stage floor. She looked up at the massive projection of her own illegal offshore accounts. The elegant, confident facade completely melted off her face, instantly replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. She looked exactly like a cornered animal. Her jaw dropped open. Her hands began to shake so violently that the manila folder fell off the podium, scattering the useless blank pages across the floor. I tapped the phone again. The final slide dropped like a nuclear bomb. The screens illuminated the high-resolution official corporate headshots of the 19 spies Julian had hired. Above their faces, the text clearly labeled them as corporate saboteurs. Beside each face was a detailed list of the specific proprietary data they had stolen, the client lists they had compromised, and the exact dates they had forwarded the information to Beatrice's shadow companies. The evidence was entirely bulletproof. It was not a vague accusation. It was a surgical, deeply undeniable presentation of massive corporate theft and market manipulation displayed in high definition for the entire financial elite of Seattle to witness. Beatrice scrambled backward, her hands flying to her mouth. She grabbed the dead microphone, desperately tapping it, trying to speak, but the sound system remained entirely locked under my control. The crowd was no longer whispering. They were shouting. Cell phones were suddenly appearing all over the room. Investors were rapidly taking pictures of the screens, documenting the routing numbers and the faces of the spies. The very people Beatrice had invited to witness my humiliation were now becoming the primary witnesses to her absolute destruction. Julian rushed towards the edge of the stage, his face entirely drained of color. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. He screamed at the hotel staff standing near the kitchen doors, wildly demanding that someone cut the power. He shouted that it was a malicious attack, begging the audience not to look at the screens. But his voice was completely drowned out by the rising chaos of the ballroom. Beatrice leaned over the edge of the stage, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly around her face. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Julian, her voice a shrill, completely unhinged shriek that echoed even without the microphone. She screamed at him to find the audiovisual booth and shut the projectors off immediately. She looked absolutely insane, her silver dress shimmering as she wildly flailed her arms, ordering her private security guards to smash the projectors if they had to. I stood in the calm, quiet shadows of my alcove, watching the empire they had built on lies completely burn to the ground in real time. My heart beat with a steady, fierce, and powerful rhythm. I did not feel an ounce of fear. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I had given them the exact public spectacle they had demanded. I had brought the paperwork, and I had delivered the final signature. The atmosphere inside the grand ballroom of the Olympic Fairmont Hotel was no longer one of elegant celebration. It had violently transformed into a scene of absolute breathless chaos. The 400 members of Seattle's financial elite were entirely captivated by the massive projector screens illuminating the stage. The damning flowcharts of Beatrice Brooks and her sprawling money-laundering syndicate glowed with a harsh, unforgiving light. The polite murmurs of high society had escalated into a deafening roar of panic, confusion, and outrage. Wealthy venture capitalists were frantically typing on their phones. Politicians who had just been drinking $1,000 champagne with Beatrice were now actively backing away toward the velvet-draped walls, desperate to put physical distance between themselves and the catastrophic implosion of the Brooks empire. I stepped out from the quiet shadows of the audiovisual alcove. The heavy silk of my blood-red gown brushed softly against the polished marble floor as I made my way toward the front of the room. Every single step I took felt like reclaiming a stolen piece of my father's legacy. I walked past the tables of terrified investors, my posture rigidly straight, my chin held high. I was no longer the invisible broken wife they had all expected to see. I was the architect of their downfall. Beatrice was standing at the acrylic podium, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her exposure. The elegant, icy silver gown she wore now seemed entirely ridiculous, a fragile costume failing to hide the desperate cornered criminal beneath. She stared up at the towering projection of her offshore bank routing numbers, her chest heaving with ragged, panicked breaths. She reached out with a trembling hand, her manicured fingers weakly grasping the neck of the microphone, but she could not form a single coherent word. I climbed the 5 carpeted steps to the main stage. The sound of my heels echoed with a sharp, deliberate rhythm that seemed to cut right through the noise of the crowd. Julian was standing near the edge of the platform, his face completely drained of color. The arrogant, condescending smirk he had worn for the past 6 months had been entirely wiped away, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He watched me approach the podium with wide, panicked eyes, finally realizing that the naive woman he had manipulated had just outplayed him on the grandest stage imaginable. I stepped right up to Beatrice. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto mine. For the first time since I had met her, there was no disdain in her expression. There was only raw, absolute fear. I reached out and gently but firmly wrapped my fingers around the cold metal of the microphone. I pulled it smoothly out of her trembling grip. She did not even try to resist. She simply stumbled backward, her high heels catching on the carpet, looking like a ghost trapped in the glaring spotlight. I turned to face the sprawling sea of wealthy investors and corporate moguls. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, heavy thuds echoed through the massive speakers, immediately silencing the frantic chatter of the ballroom. 400 pairs of eyes instantly focused entirely on me. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice ringing out clear, steady, and incredibly calm. "I apologize for the sudden change in tonight's scheduled programming. My name is Claire, and I am the Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Logistics." I let my gaze sweep across the front rows, making direct eye contact with the men and women who had come here to watch my public humiliation. I gestured casually to the massive screens behind me, the glowing evidence of stolen client lists, phantom vendor invoices, and illegal insider trading. "I was invited here tonight to publicly surrender my father's company." I continued, projecting my voice to the very back of the massive hall. "I was told to bring the final equity transfer documents so the Brooks Investment Fund could bulldoze my family's legacy and build their new commercial complex. But as you can clearly see on the screens behind me, Sterling Logistics is not for sale. However, the Brooks Investment Fund is currently under federal investigation." At that exact calculated moment, the heavy oak double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom burst open with a violently loud crash. The entire crowd whipped their heads around in profound shock. A literal flood of federal agents poured into the opulent room. They did not wear tuxedos or evening gowns. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the SEC emblazoned across their backs. The lead agent held up a gold badge, his voice booming over the stunned silence of the wealthy guests. He ordered absolutely everyone to remain exactly where they were and instructed his teams to immediately secure all exits. The undercover agents, who had been flawlessly posing as catering staff and security personnel, suddenly dropped their silver trays and pulled out their official credentials, stepping seamlessly into formation to block the service hallways. The trap had snapped entirely shut. The perimeter was completely locked down. There was absolutely nowhere left for anyone to run. Beatrice let out a high, piercing shriek that sounded entirely inhuman. The elegant matriarch of the Seattle financial elite completely lost her aristocratic mind. She wildly lunged toward the back edge of the stage, desperately trying to find a staircase leading to the service corridors. But 2 female FBI agents were already moving swiftly up the platform. They intercepted Beatrice before she could even reach the curtain. They grabbed her arms, spinning her around with practiced, forceful efficiency. Beatrice thrashed wildly, screaming at the top of her lungs. She demanded to know if they realized who they were touching. She threatened to sue the entire federal government. She shrieked that she was a personal friend of the governor and promised to end their careers by morning. The federal agents did not care about her money, her influence, or her high society connections. One agent smoothly pulled Beatrice's arms behind her back, while the other retrieved a pair of heavy, cold steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic click of the restraint snapping closed over her expensive silk gloves echoed loudly across the silent stage. The agent began reading Beatrice her Miranda rights, reciting the long list of federal charges including wire fraud, massive securities manipulation, and criminal racketeering. The ultimate untouchable vulture of the Seattle real estate market was being physically dragged away in her designer gown, her entire legacy reduced to a public spectacle of absolute disgrace. I turned my attention away from Beatrice and looked down. Julian was standing at the base of the stage stairs. He was entirely trapped. Two SEC investigators were standing firmly behind him, their hands resting on their belts, waiting for their turn to process his arrest. My husband looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive custom-tailored tuxedo was wrinkled. Sweat was visibly pouring down his pale forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He looked up at me, his chest heaving with frantic, desperate breaths. When our eyes met, he completely broke down. He lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the stage with both hands. Tears were streaming freely down his cheeks. He was no longer the arrogant, condescending chess player who had tossed his wedding ring onto my kitchen counter and called me naive. He was a terrified, sniveling coward, realizing that his entire life of luxury and unearned privilege was about to end behind federal prison bars. He reached out, his trembling fingers frantically grasping the fabric of my red silk dress. He looked up at me, sobbing openly in front of the federal agents and the silent crowd. He begged me to stop the investigation. He cried that he had no idea his mother was taking things this far. He desperately tried to rewrite the entire history of his betrayal, claiming that he was just as much of a victim as I was. He pleaded with me to remember the early days of our relationship. He brought up the tiny apartment we used to share, the peanut butter sandwiches I used to pack for his lunch, the massive student loans I had worked so hard to pay off. He sobbed, telling me that I was his wife, that we had stood at an altar and made sacred vows to protect each other for better or for worse. He begged me to show him just a tiny ounce of mercy. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man who had actively orchestrated the destruction of my family. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no sorrow. The lingering ghost of the love I once held for him had been permanently eradicated the morning he revealed the 3-year con. I reached down and calmly peeled his sweaty, trembling fingers off the fabric of my dress. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression completely void of any emotional warmth. I slowly lifted my left hand. I had put my diamond wedding ring back on, just for this evening, playing the final note of the submissive wife illusion. With deliberate, incredibly slow movements, I pinched the heavy diamond band between my thumb and forefinger and slid it completely off my finger. Julian was still holding his crystal champagne flute in his right hand. The expensive liquid was sloshing wildly against the rim because his hand was shaking so badly. I held the diamond ring directly over the rim of his glass. I looked into his terrified, weeping eyes and offered him a slow, incredibly cold smile. "It is just business, Julian," I said, keeping my voice low enough that only he could hear the absolute finality in my tone. "And you are completely bankrupt." I opened my fingers. The diamond wedding ring dropped straight down, hitting the bottom of the crystal flute with a sharp, heavy clink. The golden champagne bubbles rushed up to surround the sunken metal, drowning the very last symbol of our fraudulent marriage. Julian stared down at the glass, his mouth opening and closing silently. He had absolutely nothing left to say. The two SEC investigators stepped forward, firmly gripping his shoulders and pulling him away from the stage. They secured his wrists behind his back with plastic zip ties, treating him with the exact same unceremonious efficiency they would use on any common street criminal. I stood on the brightly lit stage, surrounded by federal agents securing the evidence, and watched the grand finale of my mother-in-law's carefully planned charity gala. I watched Beatrice Brooks and my former husband, being physically perp, walk down the long, opulent center aisle of the ballroom. The society photographers who had been hired to document my public surrender instantly swarmed the arrested executives. The room erupted in a blinding storm of camera flashes capturing the absolute humiliation and total destruction of the Brooks Empire for tomorrow morning's front-page news. I walked down the stairs of the stage and moved through the parting crowd. The wealthy elite physically stepped aside to give me a wide, respectful berth. Nobody dared to say a single word to me. I walked out of the massive double doors through the grand lobby and out into the cool, crisp Seattle night. Diane Vance, my brilliant corporate litigator, was waiting near the valet stand. She looked at me, a genuine smile of deep professional respect crossing her face, and offered a simple, silent nod. We had won. The phantom vendors were frozen. The offshore accounts were entirely seized by federal warrants. The 19 corporate spies were currently being rounded up at their homes by local authorities. My father's massive logistical network was finally safe, completely purged of the parasitic infection that had tried to kill it. I took a deep breath of the fresh night air, feeling an immense, profound sense of peace settle over my shoulders. I was 28 years old. I had survived a devastating loss, a horrifying betrayal, and a highly coordinated corporate siege. I was no longer just the daughter of a hard-working truck driver. I was the undisputed, uncontested sole owner and chief executive officer of Sterling Logistics. I was going to take my father's legacy rebuild, the broken supply chains rehire Thomas with a massive executive promotion, and run my company exactly the way it was meant to be run, with absolute honesty, fierce loyalty, and uncompromising strength. I know many of you watching this right now have probably faced your own versions of betrayal. You might have been underestimated by your own family, dismissed by a partner you trusted entirely, or told that you were too emotional, too weak, or too naive to fight back against people with more money and more power. I want you to remember one very important thing. Your worth is never defined by the people who try to manipulate you. True power does not come from a trust fund, an expensive suit, or a corner office. True power comes from knowing exactly who you are, keeping your eyes wide open to the truth, and having the sheer unyielding courage to stand up and refuse to be a victim. You do not ever have to accept the narrative that someone else writes for you. You have the absolute right to gather your evidence, build your own armor, and burn their toxic empires straight to the ground. If you have ever had to fight back against a manipulator who thought you were an easy target, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and let me know how you finally took your power back. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. If this journey resonated with you, if you believe in setting ironclad boundaries and watching justice finally be served, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more stories of survival and strength waiting for you here. Until next time, remember to trust your instincts, protect your peace, and never let anyone convince you that you are not strong enough to win the war. 6 entire months have passed since the night the grand ballroom of the Olympic Fairmont Hotel became ground zero for the largest corporate fraud bust in Seattle history. It is absolutely amazing how much your entire universe can shift in just 180 days. 6 months ago, I was shivering on the cold hardwood floor of my kitchen, completely stripped of my finances, my company, and my dignity by the man I loved. Today, the world looks entirely different. The dust has finally settled over the Pacific Northwest, and the sheer magnitude of the devastation left in the wake of the federal raid is still making front-page news across the country. The transition from absolute suffocating chaos to profound peace did not happen overnight. The weeks immediately following the charity gala were a grueling, exhausting marathon of endless legal depositions and fierce corporate restructuring. I spent countless hours sitting in sterile, bright government conference rooms with Diane Vance, handing over every single piece of digital evidence I had ripped from my father's basement server. The federal prosecutors did not just build a criminal case, they constructed an absolute, inescapable fortress of undeniable guilt around Beatrice Brooks and her entire financial syndicate. Beatrice is currently residing in a federal detention center, actively awaiting a sentencing hearing that her own defense attorneys openly admit is nothing more than a bleak, inevitable formality. The incredibly arrogant woman who once wore tailored charcoal suits and icy silver gowns, who paraded around high society charity events acting like royalty, now wears a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The Department of Justice hit her with a staggering heavy list of charges: wire fraud, money laundering, massive insider trading, corporate espionage, criminal racketeering. The digital evidence was so incredibly overwhelming, so perfectly documented by her own hubris, that her high-priced legal team could not even attempt to negotiate a basic plea deal. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were completely seized by federal authorities within 48 hours of the gala. Every single one of her dummy corporations and shadow networks was systematically dismantled. The Brooks Investment Fund, the untouchable predatory financial empire she used to bully and destroy honest, hard-working businesses, was completely liquidated by the government to pay immediate restitution to the clients and vendors she had callously defrauded. She is facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal prison. For a woman of her advanced age, accustomed to a life of absolute luxury silk bedsheets and unchecked power, it is a definitive life sentence. She will spend the rest of her natural days behind bars, stripped entirely of her wealth, her massive influence, and her towering, venomous pride. And then there is Julian, the charming, sophisticated man who looked me dead in the eye, tossed his golden wedding ring onto our marble kitchen island, and called me naive. His spectacular fall from grace has been a brutal, relentless, and entirely self-inflicted downward spiral. Because his name was directly listed as the primary financial proxy on the forged routing contracts and the dummy vendor accounts, the federal government immediately froze every single personal and corporate asset attached to his identity. The millions of dollars he thought he had successfully funneled offshore were confiscated before he even stepped out of the police transport van that night. Today, Julian is drowning in a suffocating ocean of insurmountable legal debt. He was entirely blacklisted from the financial sector. No reputable firm, bank, or logistics company in the entire country will even let him walk through their lobby doors. The elite social circle he prized above all else, the wealthy friends he desperately sought to impress, abandoned him the exact second the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He has absolutely no money, no professional network, and zero prospects for the future. I heard through my legal team that he is currently living in a dingy weekly rate motel on the far industrial outskirts of Tacoma. In a twist of absolute poetic irony, it is located just a few miles away from the exact same 24-hour diner where my accountant handed me the black ledger that ended his life of luxury. Julian actually tried to call me a few months ago from an unlisted prepaid number. He left a pathetic, weeping voicemail begging me to speak to the federal prosecutors on his behalf. He tried to claim he was simply following his mother's aggressive orders, attempting to paint himself as just another one of her innocent victims. I deleted the message before he even finished his sentence. I filed for a heavily expedited divorce on the absolute grounds of criminal fraud, securing a legal judgment that left him entirely destitute. He walked away from our marriage with exactly what he brought into it: nothing but lies. The 19 corporate spies, the arrogant, highly paid consultants who swaggered around my warehouse acting like they owned my father's legacy, folded faster than a cheap house of cards. The second the FBI presented them with the intercepted communications from the legacy server, they immediately turned on each other. There is no honor among corporate thieves. They scrambled desperately to secure immunity deals, practically tripping over themselves to testify against Beatrice and Julian in exchange for lighter sentences. They are all currently facing severe criminal charges. Their professional credentials have been permanently revoked, and their lucrative careers have been completely destroyed by their own insatiable greed. While their toxic, parasitic world burned to ashes, I slowly and meticulously rebuilt mine. The very first action I took as the newly undisputed sole owner of Sterling Logistics was to drive directly to Thomas's house. I knocked on his front door on a quiet Sunday morning. When he answered, looking exhausted and worn down by the stress of his wrongful termination, I handed him a massive, beautiful bouquet of flowers for his wife. I looked him in the eye and officially offered him the position of Chief Financial Officer. He broke down and wept right there on his front porch. Today, Thomas manages every single penny that flows through our operation, and I trust him with my absolute life. We spent the first 3 months engaging in a massive campaign of transparency and sincere apologies. We reached out directly to the independent truckers and loyal vendors that Julian's people had wrongly terminated. We explained the entire hostile takeover, showed them the manipulated data, and offered them highly lucrative long-term contracts to return to our network. Every single one of them came back. We reached out to the major retail clients Beatrice had tried to steal, demonstrating exactly how our proprietary bidding system had been hijacked. When those executives saw the raw honesty and the sheer undeniable resilience of our operation, they not only reinstated our exclusive contracts, they significantly increased their shipping volume with us. Sterling Logistics is now absolutely booming. The warehouse floor is alive with the deafening, beautiful, rhythmic roar of heavy forklifts, the shouting of busy dispatchers, and the constant hum of outgoing delivery trucks. The suffocating fear and dark paranoia that plagued my loyal employees during the Brooks occupation have completely vanished. They have been replaced by a fierce, undeniable loyalty and a shared sense of profound victory. We are breaking all of our previous profit records every single fiscal quarter. We heavily modernized the internal routing software and fully secured the new digital network with top-tier encryption, but I explicitly ordered the IT team to keep the physical legacy server bolted to the concrete floor in the basement. It sits there in the dark as a quiet, powerful reminder of the brilliant, paranoid man who saved us all from beyond the grave. I am currently sitting in my father's old executive office. The space feels entirely different now. The heavy oak desk smells like rich lemon polish and fresh, honest paperwork. The afternoon sun is finally breaking through the thick gray Seattle clouds, casting a warm, bright golden glow across the expansive room. I'm looking out the large, clear windows, watching massive, fully loaded freight trucks roll out of the loading docks, carrying the absolute lifeblood of our company across the Pacific Northwest. The deep, agonizing grief of losing my dad is still there. It is a quiet, permanent ache in my chest that I know will never completely fade away. But it is no longer a suffocating, paralyzing weight. It is mixed with a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace and immense pride. I know he is watching over this warehouse. I know he's incredibly proud of the woman I had to become to protect his dream. I lean back in his heavy leather chair and take a long, slow sip of dark roast coffee. The ceramic mug in my hand was a gift Thomas bought for me just last week to celebrate our record-breaking quarter. It is simple, heavy, and features a single bold word printed across the front in thick black lettering: Boss. If there is one thing this entire harrowing nightmare taught me, it is this: never confuse setting boundaries with cruelty, and never set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones sleeping in the bed next to you. Have you ever had to fight to protect what was yours from the people you trusted most? Tell me your story down in the comments. I read every single one. If you felt a sense of justice watching this, please hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story. And before you go, drop a comment letting me know what state or country you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Thank you for being here. And remember, you define your worth, nobody else. Take care of yourself.